Hello, we are looking at some structural considerations in the Olivet Discourse, or Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, Jesus is describing the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the second coming, and he's answering the questions that the disciples asked. Let me scroll up to the top of this chapter here in Matthew 24. He's answering the questions the disciples asked. Tell us, when will these things be? We're right here in the midst of verse 3. When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age? Now, this is very clearly in reference to, as Jesus said, you see all these things. We're talking about, in the verse before, the buildings of the temple. This is the temple that was visible then, and Jesus says, you see all these things. Jesus is clearly talking about the second temple. And when the disciples ask the questions that the entire rest of the chapter is answering, they're saying, when will these things be? The very things that Jesus said, you see all these. This is in reference to what is visible then, the second temple. It cannot appear, or it cannot apply to any other in our understanding, because there is absolutely no other context here. This was literally fulfilled in 70 AD when the Romans took every stone apart to get the gold from the temple that had melted when they burned the temple when they took over the city. And so Matthew 24 is looking at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. As we've looked up through verse 21, where it's talking about the Great Tribulation, and this was fulfilled in 70 AD, and these days being cut short, the passage from verse 23 down to 28 then is contrasting and saying, hey, don't confuse the destruction of Jerusalem with the second coming that I'm about to describe. Whereas the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, they were told to look to the holy place for the abomination, and they were told to look for Jerusalem surrounded by armies. That was a localized event. 23 through 28 then contrasts that, and just like it says in verse 27 here, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines in the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Jesus is saying, okay, now I've been talking about a local event, and now don't confuse what I'm about to say with that. This is different. And so now he's going to go into the second coming, which is yet future. Many preterists would say that the second coming is already past as well. They actually say that verse 29 through 31 happened in 70 AD. I disagree. But the contrast here is that Jesus is contrasting, and where the first events were a local event, what Jesus is saying is, but what I'm about to tell you, this it says right here in this, so will the coming of the Son of Man be coming of the Son of Man. This coming of the Son of Man will be like lightning in the east as from the west. It will be a global thing. You will not miss it. It's not about if you're in the mountains or here or there. No, if you're on the earth, you will see this. And this is what Jesus is contrasting in this section. So then we have to come down and look here at what is the second coming of Christ, which is yet future. All up to now has already been accomplished in 70 AD. But here in Matthew 24:29, we have another section for 3 verses. Now, some of this I'm going to leave for the next video. If you want the full details on this, it's going to take a little more development to demonstrate. It's not all that in-depth of a proof, but I will simply cover it for now, and then I will develop it in the next video. Simply because there's a bit here. But what we have by the traditional reading is that it says immediately after the tribulation. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. The problem with this interpretation, if you haven't seen this already, if you've studied this, you're probably already aware of what's going on here. The very first word of this second coming section is the word immediately. It is extremely hard to get out of the language here, and I do not intend to. What I will demonstrate further in another video, because I'm focusing more on the structural elements here, but it's a clear case, is that this word immediately in the Greek, I am not a Greek scholar. I have read other people's appraisals of this, but the Greek here is the Greek word eutheos, de meta. I'm probably slaughtering the pronunciation here, but it's three words which could be translated immediately but after. There's two parts to it. First of all, it is immediately, and second of all, it is after. The problem with this is the word that's translated immediately here. Without going into the full case to support this, I make very few references to the Greek and to translation issues because this is not my strong point. However, after analyzing this and looking at the greater structure of Matthew 24 and its implications, I believe this is the stronger case. The word for immediately here is from the Greek word straight. Eutheos means straight. When it says in the book of Acts, it says they were on the street called Straight. This is the same word, eutheos or euthus. The issue here is that immediately is actually an imprecise translation of the word. There's several other cases in the New Testament, and I will give those in the next video. Several other cases, this word is translated, and it clearly has a gap. The word comes from the word straight, and a more direct translation would be, the word direct or next. Some translations translate almost all the instances of this word as straight way. The problem comes down when you analyze what the Greek is trying to say in the semantic use of the word. It can mean a very short period of time, but literally it means from point A to point B that it's in a straight line, meaning directly or next or straight way. Now, by implication, this can of course mean immediately, but the English word immediate means I, meaning no, and mediately, or medium, meaning no middle. So the word immediately here actually implies no middle or no duration time at all. But the word eutheos simply means directly, straight way. Some of the issue also comes in because we have immediately but after. Sorry about that here. Immediately but after. Eutheos de meta. Meta means after here. The traditional reading has prevailed in many of the cases. In one of the translations, I believe it's the Revised Standard Version, they translate eutheos as straightway in almost all cases. But here, because it's conjoined with de meta, it would be an awkward translation if you don't understand the implication of what's going on, to say next but after. Immediately after flows better in English, and so that's probably one of the reasons why the traditional King James translation of this has prevailed in most of the translations. But what Jesus is doing here is he's not saying immediately. He's saying straightway but after. And this is the point. There are two things that are important. First, this word eutheos can mean there's a duration of time in between. Several other places in the New Testament, it can be hours, it can be days, it could even be months just by some of the New Testament examples. There is no actual limit. The only thing is that it proceeds from a straight line from here to there. This is all that the word eutheos means. Yes, this is also a word that's used in most of the miracles of Jesus. Immediately he became well, but in most situations it would mean a very short period of time, because of the surrounding events. However, all that is being indicated here is eutheos de meta, straight way, but after. Jesus has just described the events leading up to 70 AD, up through verse 22. If those days had not been cut short, no flesh would have been saved, speaking of 70 AD. He has then contrasted the first set of events in verses 23 through 28, saying that one was a local one, and the next one is going to be global. As the lightning comes from the east is seen in the west, so will be the Son of Man. It will be visible everywhere. You don't have to worry about missing it or being in a particular place. And so it is in this context that Jesus begins to answer the original question. And again, I will develop the eutheos argument in another one. If you want to just take my word for it, at least for the sake of my argument, the word immediately here it would be better translated as next. Jesus is just saying that the next thing in the series of events, not dealing with time, simply dealing with a straight line from here to here, because that's all that eutheos is really implying. What Jesus is getting at is next but after. So he's saying that this thing is the next thing, but it's this second word right here that's beginning to answer the original question. The original question was, if we go back up to the top, when? Tell us, when will these things be? As we see right here in verse 3. When will these things be? And so Jesus is beginning now to answer the question. He has begun describing the first set of events leading up to 70 AD. When will these things be? When will these things be? Referring to the destruction of the second temple. As for what you see here, it says in one of the translations of one of the versions. We're talking about the second temple. So when will these things be? This is beginning to answer that question right here in verse 29. Immediately but after. So Jesus has described the 70 AD events first. Then he has contrasted them. And now he's going to describe the second coming, which is the second half of their question. And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So he's going to go into that, but he's beginning to answer the timing question, and that is found in this little word right after. In this little word, after. It's next, but after. So Jesus says the 70 AD thing will happen. The next thing that's going to happen, but you can be sure it's but after. After the tribulation. So he establishes sequence. When will these things be, and what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? First, he establishes sequence. He lays down in no uncertain terms that the tribulation will happen and be concluded. The days will be cut short. And then the verse says, and then he contrasts the two. But he says, next, but after. And this establishes sequence. He says this is the next thing, but it will be after the tribulation of those days. And then he goes on to describe his second coming. Then will appear in the heaven the sign of the Son of Man, appear in the clouds, with great power and great glory. And he will send out the angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. And so right here, we have the establishment of both things. As we said, in Matthew chapter 20, verse 4, verse 3, the questions again. There's two questions here. When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? This is answered in a summarily fashion by first he describes the first set of events, these things. He's again talking about the Matthew 24, 1 through 3. He's talking about the destruction of the second temple that's in view right then. Then he says the next thing, then immediately, or actually should be straightway or directly, it is not an indication of time. He says next but after, and he establishes the sequence. He says the 70 AD thing will happen, and after that, the second coming, it will not happen until the 70 AD destruction is complete. The second coming will come after the days are cut short and flesh is saved. It must be not in that period. It must be next, possibly removed by an undisclosed amount of time, because the word eutheos in verse 29, eutheos de meta, the eutheos, you have to determine by context if it can have a gap there. But he describes the first set of situations. The 70 AD describes the contrast between that. Don't confuse the 70 AD with my second coming. Like lightning will be east and from the west, so will the second coming of the Son of Man. And now he is describing the second coming with the initial part of the answer to the actual question, which is after. The first one will come first, and the second one will be next, but after. And like I said, I will go into a further proof either in this video or the next video, one of the next videos on the eutheos here. And we'll also go into the final answer of the actual question of when, down here in verse 20, down in verse 24 and onward in another video as well. So I hope you tune into those. Thank you very much.